Well, hi again everybody. Welcome to my latest video. Well, in this video I'm going to cover the second lesson of my Advanced Excel course. And in particular, I'm going to focus this particular lesson entirely on macros. Now, I'm not going to get into the detailed Visual Basic programming to any extent at all, really. I'm going to give one little example, making a change to an existing one in Visual Basic, but nothing fancy at all. If you really want to learn how to do Visual Basic programming in Excel, there's a whole book about it. This is an older version of it. It comes with DVD to show you how old it is. It's really for the 2010 version of Excel. The newer version, it's all online. So you can, if you buy the book, they give you a code to log in and you can get to all of the sample code that's out there. And some of the sample code is phenomenal. So I highly recommend that in terms of, really learning how to do Excel programming. Very thick, over 1,000 pages. You're in there quite a while, but it covers every single aspect of what you can do. I mean, the power of it. And I've made some very sophisticated programs, which I may show in a later lesson. Let me get into it, and if you get something out of this particular lesson that you find useful, helpful in any way, it would be very helpful if you subscribe to my channel. First thing I'm going to do is correct some errors that I had, or not really errors, but issues I had with that last spreadsheet example that I did. I have it up on the screen right now. A couple of things that I did there would work, but not 100% of the time. So I want to make something a little more what we call bulletproof. So I want to add a new row and have it automatically assign the next ID number and the hourly rate, just as I last time when we created this. The first thing I want to do is start a macro. Now you have your choice too. What I didn't show you last time was you can either click it up here, or you could be in any one of the drop-down menus, and then you just click down here on this little button, and that'll actually start a macro recording. So let's try it that way this time. I will then come in here and I will start the macro running. I'll call this one macro 3. Actually, I'm going to call it add employee 3. Leave everything else alone, say OK. So you see that thing running. I could stop it with this little box here. What's the first thing I want to do is I want to sort by hourly rate. So I'm going to click on the little down arrow here. I'm going to say sort smallest to largest. So now we have the small one at the top. I'm going to use column J, the title entry for it. And I'm going to say that that equals this top entry minus 0.25. Enter. We could validate that it's right. And then over here, we're going to say that this one, we're going to use a special formula now, right? It won't be what I did before. Let me explain this one. I'm going to say that this equals the max value of some range. Once I open up with parentheses, it gives you an idea of how to use it. Or you could do the help in Excel to find out more about that. I want the entire column D, so I highlight it. It knows enough that anything that's text, including this title, doesn't count, so it won't include that in figuring out who the max value is. If I then come over here and I close the parentheses and I hit enter, I have the max value in there, but this max value is not correct. It's the same exact value. So I click on it again, come over here, and I say plus 1, and I hit enter there. So now this one is 1 greater than that, while this one is 25 cents less than that. So we're now done for that part of it. Now I have to actually insert the new row. So I come over here and I right click, and I say insert. So it's going to by default insert an entire row because I highlighted an entire row. Now I want to get these two values over to these two cells here, but I do not want them as formulas like they currently are. So I will highlight them with the left mouse button. I will copy. I will come over here to the first column I want to go at. I will right click and I will say paste, but I'm not going to say paste as is. I'm going to say paste values only. So now if I look at this, it's only a value, not a formula, as opposed to these are formulas. If I hadn't done it that way, we would have had the formula here as well. So now let me clean up a little bit. I'm going to highlight this row again. I do not want bold. So I'm going to click on it, go to home, and turn off the bold indicator. So that's good. And then I want to get rid of these two extraneous scratch values. So I'm just going to go to them and hit delete. And we are now done. So if I come over here, and I stop the macro, that little square there, the macro is now stopped, because if I look at it again, it shows that that there's no macro running. If I run the macro, what does it do? Come over here to developers, where I like to go, and I say macros. and now we see add emp3. I'm going to just run it, and it added it, and it bumped the employee number up, and it bumped down the starting hourly rate. If I run it again, it'll just keep on working every time. If I had given it a hotkey, a control, and some other key, which was a choice when I first created the macro, then I could be using that to run the macro. Like if I had said I wanted to do control M, I could have set it that way. And then I would just have to hold a control key down and hit the M key on the keyboard. Okay, the next thing I want to show is actually the code that gets generated, what we call the visual basic code that's behind the macro that we just created. So if I stay in developer, but this time I'm going to pick this little button right here, view code. And in the view code, we can now actually view the actual code of the macro. This is organized in a very unusual way. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of that right now, but just to let you know that we have to search around a little bit in order to find out exactly where the code is for this module. There's a hint to it. The VBA project, it's given the name of the file, Excel EX2, and there's something underneath that called modules. So if I click on that, there's only one module of code. There could be many if it's a very complex set of macros for that particular project, but this one only has one. And if I double click on that, I will see the code that we just created for that particular macro. I'm not going to get into deciphering all of this. Some of it is pretty self-explanatory. First of all, we see the old macro here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. We don't need the old one anymore. So let me get rid of that. So now that macro is gone, the one that we originally had. But this one here, you can see things like it's referencing the active worksheet, in this case sheet 1. You can see things like it's checking certain types of parameters about the sheet. Over here you can actually see that a formula is put into the cell. So on the formula cell C1, R1, row 1, column 1, that's what that designation is, this formula was put in, which says row 1, column -5. It took that and then subtracted from that sum value that represented by that column 25 cents. It did all the individual little itsy bitsy steps, way more steps than we generally need, but it does that by default, including selecting, that's basically moving the cursor to a different cell. It has a lot of different specific things here that there are simpler ways of doing it. But as I said earlier, I'm not here to teach you how to code macros. I just want to show you how to do a couple of key things to it. I am going to modify this macro right now. So this is the code to it, and I'm going to make a simple modification. Right as it gets started, I'm going to put a test, actually a question. So the question I'm going to put is a piece of code, and I'm going to first have to create a variable. Now, it defaults to certain data types if you don't declare it, but I like to always declare it because you can make Visual Basic structured or not structured, if anybody's familiar with that term, when it comes to creating a computer program. I like to make my programs structured. So let me declare the variable that I want to use. And I do that with dim or dimension. I'm going to dimension a variable named ANS, abbreviation for answer, and I'm going to make it an integer value. And it all automatically recognizes it. It gives me the chance to pick something different if I was typing it to mean something else. But they got it right, so I'll just hit enter. Then I'm going to go through and say assign the variable answer, ANS, from the equal sign means assign that value from some function. The function I'm going to use is called MessageBox, MSGBOX. There's a lot of options to MessageBox, as you can see here. The minute I open up the paren, it gives you all the different things you can do with it. I'm only going to use some of these. I'm going to give it a displayed text value. So I'm going to just put in a prompt, and I'm going to say, do you really want to add a new employee? Double checking with you, basically. That's my prompt. Now I'm going to say, what is it that I want it to do? It's going to create a little dialog box with buttons on it. At least that's how I want to use it in this example. So I'm going to assign the next parameter, which is which buttons do I want? And the ones that I'm particularly interested in is the Visual Basic. These are flags. They're actually bit flags. I'm not going to get into that too much, but I want two different ones assigned, yes and no. And as you can see, it already highlighted. It thinks I want that. That's what I click on. I can double click on that and we're done. And then I'm going to close the paren and we're done with that. So what it's going to do, it's going to display the message in a little box. Do you really want to add a new employee? And it's going to give two choices, a yes and a no. Now, I could even have it default to one of them. That's another parameter to that. But there's no point in this particular stage of just trying to demonstrate this to you. But now what am I going to do after you answer that? Well, the answer is going to be a number that's going to get assigned different values depending on whether it was a yes that you clicked on or a no. Now, I really don't care what those values are. So I'm going to say there happens to be fixed constants for the ones that we expect back from that particular function. Message box, as I said earlier, is a Visual Basic function. So I'm going to say if ANS equals Visual Basic no, does it equal that value? If it does, I am going to do a jump. Now this is sort of a violation of structured code, but I don't want to have to restructure this whole module right now. It's a simple little thing. It's not the best way to do it, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say go to, and I give it a label, and I'm going to create a label down below. And the label I'm going to create is exit macro, exit under macro. So it's going to jump down to that label. Now I don't have that label right now, so I might get an error when I go and move the cursor, but I'm going to put the label down here. And I like to make it so it's a little bit easier to stick out. So I'm going to tab backwards. So if I do shift tab, it backs up the previous tab stop, and that's where I'm going to put the label. Now I could have said exit sub because this is a subroutine that was created that represents this macro, but I may want to do something else other than just get out. So I'm going to leave that possibility by putting the label here, exit under macro, and I got to give it a colon. If you want to dress it up nice, you put an extra carriage. Extra carriage returns don't matter. So now we've changed that macro, and that's really all to the extent I'm going to get into Visual Basic. In future videos that I create, whether there be more like advanced versions of Excel or something else that's more programming oriented, I will go into Visual Basic programming and some of the options to it in a lot more detail. I always like to come over here and do a save. It's telling me it's going to save it. Now I've been in this window here where I'm looking at code. The actual Excel spreadsheet is still behind us. So I can leave that back there. I'm just covering it up right now with the spreadsheet. So what happens now if I run this macro? Again, it doesn't matter where I am. Let me go and say macros. Notice that add employee 2 is now gone because I deleted it from the code. So I'll just say run. I get a pop-up. Now I could have had it said something else other than Microsoft Excel. That was one of the options to the message box, which I did not fill in, just to let you know. But it did put the prompt. Do you really want to add a new employee? And I could type yes or no. And it defaulted to the first one. That's why you see the blue box around it. So if I just hit enter, that's what it will take. Or I could click on it. Either way, click on it and boom, it worked. And every time I run it now, it will do the same thing. If I run the macro, it prompts me again. And this time I'll just hit enter and it did it. What happens if I say no? Macros, run. Now I'm going to click the no. It just exited. The macro didn't do anything. And that's the way I had changed that particular macro to function. Okay, now I'm going to show you something that is important to know about macros. As you recall, when we created this macro, it only had the scope of being within this particular workbook. Now, as long as I take this workbook with me or send it to another computer, the macro will follow it. Well, there are times when you want to create a macro that you want to use for all your workbook, or you may want to use it on all your computers for all your workbook. So how do you do that? Well, there's something called the personal macro library. If I come in here right now and take a look at the code, once again, you see the macro that I have here, and you see these sections. Well, right now we only have these top line sections created for large projects. Now, one of the ones that's there is Solver. That was the thing we turned on. It's actually a set of giant macros. I can't even look at it though because it's protected. I have to put a password in. Obviously, Microsoft doesn't want you to see the code for that. What's not here, just take note of these 4 sections: ATPVBN, Solver, our project, and this thing called VBA project Fun Crest. Those were existing projects. 3 of them came with it before I did anything, and I added this third one. So what do we do? What am I trying to do? I'm trying to show you how we can create a new section to this that becomes somewhat permanent, at least to you as a user of Excel for sure. And if you copy it over to another computer, then it will follow you along to that other computer as well. Let's make a new macro. I'm going to make a macro that's going to delete a row. Very simple macro. So I'm going to click this little box here, and it's going to say, what do I want to name the macro? I'm going to call this delete row. Well, that's a very simple one, but I just want to show an example. I could make it say delete 2 rows. How's that? But you see where the scope is just set for store macro in this workbook? I want to change that. You have other choices. I could make it for a brand new workbook that doesn't exist yet, or I could do this one thing, personal macro workbook. That is a workbook that gets carried along once created on every single run of Excel that you do. And it's stored actually in your profile for Excel under your particular login. But it is something you can copy over as long as you copy your profile over. So I'm going to put it there. And I'm going to say OK, which means the macro will then be, or is now running. I'm going to highlight 2 rows, and I'm going to delete. That's it. That's all I want to do. Let me stop this macro. Now let's look at the code and see what we got. If I go back to code now, this one always pops up. I should now have a new section added. Notice there was 4 before, and that is a new one called personal. If I expand this out, you'll see the full description of it. It's called personal XLSB, which are the macros that are for you personally as a user of this computer. And if I expand this, I see a module there as well. Let me look at that. Let me open up that module, and there we go. That's the whole macro. Basically, we are selecting 2 rows, rows 2 and 3. By the way, I was very specific about that. I only selected those 2 rows. It won't work on any other 2 rows. And then I deleted them. Selection, delete. But now it's part of my personal macros. Now, where is it actually stored? Well, that's a little bit version dependent, depending on the version of Excel that you have. But let me quickly show you where it put it. And if I come in here and I go to this PC, let me pick my profile area. I'll go into Drive C, I'll go into Users, I'll go into David Admin, that's the only user I have. I typed in App Data, which was a hidden directory in there. And then within that directory, there's now a visible directory called Roaming. And then there's another one within that called Microsoft. And there's another one in here called Excel. And then there's one here. This is what got created. In here is that actual file. But all you have to do is copy this directory, bring it to the other computer, store it in the same location, assuming you have the same version of Excel, and then you'll have that macro available to you. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to show you here for this lesson is how to make accessing your macros a little more convenient. Now, you did see when we created the macro, we could put a hotkey on it. But you see this ribbon here, the Excel ribbon? Well, you can make a new tab to that if you want and put all your macros visible there if you'd like to do that. So let me show you how to do it. You've seen this before in the previous lesson. If I go to File, I go to Options, and I say Customize Ribbon. These are all of the top line tabs that are up here. That's how we turned on Developer, as you may recall. Well, what if I want to create a new tab? I can just have to click in this box here. Actually, I can put it anywhere I want. It'll go after what I've highlighted. If I wanted to go after Home, I first highlight the Home, and then I'll say New Tab. If I want it after some other place, I could do it there. Let me go after Page Layout, and I'll say New Tab. What do I want to call this tab? I can actually rename it. I'm going to call it, rather than the default name of New Tab, I'm going to call it My Macros. And then when I click OK to this, actually I can create a new group. The groups are the things that are underneath it. So for example, if you look at any one of these, we're under Developer now, you notice there's groups of stuff. They're separated by a vertical bar. So I can group things differently. So I can actually say, what do I want to call this new group? It'll by default create one, so I'll just name it to something. I'll say rename it, and I get to pick a name and an icon to it. That's interesting. You pick whatever icon you want. That's choosable here, or you can add others, which I'm not going to get into right now. What do I want to call this group? I will say Addition M. Just picking a name, Addition Macros, but I don't want to type the whole thing out. And I'll say OK. So now we have the new tab, and we have a new group underneath that tab. So now that I've created this new group, I want to put something in it. So if I right click on it and I come over here to popular commands, I can take a look at what's available to me. And one of the choices is macros. So I will pick the macros, and all the macros I have are now listed. So I pick whatever macro I want. Let's pick the one where I did the add employee 3. I'll put that one in there. So if I click on that one and I say add, we now have a button added to add employee 3. Let me say OK to that. And now look what we got here. We've got a new My Macros tab. There's one group in it called Addition M. and there's one macro on it called add employee 3, and all I have to do now to run it is click on that add employee 3, and it asks me, do I want to make sure I am? I'll say yes, and it's added a new employee. Hopefully you learned something. I actually enjoyed doing it. It got to teach everybody something about Excel and possibly how to do some advanced Excel programming, or at least get started with it. So if you got something out of this video that you found useful or enjoyable in any way, please do me a favor and at least consider subscribing to my channel. My head will pop up here. Click on it, follow along. You'll also be given the opportunity of clicking the little bell if you want notifications, and if you have it configured by the default, then you will get an email whenever I put a new video up. I'm not asking you to do that though. All I want you to do is subscribe for now, and that way the next time you go into YouTube, you'll see the list of your channels that you subscribe to on the left hand side, and anybody that has a new video, depending on your version of your browser, will either show a red dot or a black dot next to that channel name, and you'll be able to see that the new video is available for you to watch. So please consider doing that. I hope everybody is doing well these days, and everybody stays well these days. And until the next video, take care.